Hello, everybody. I just came out of the shower, and like when you're in the shower, you either sing or you think about things. And I was thinking about this video that I've talked about posting for so long about how your brain is changed by birth control. I'm going to focus on the pill, like the hormonal contraceptive pill. And I say hormonal because it doesn't actually contain hormones. It's sold to us as hormonal contraception, but it is actually artificial hormone like substances that inhibit, aka block, the production of your own hormones. So it's not a hormonal pill, but you know what I'm talking about when I'm referring to it. The reason I've postponed this for so long is because I really wanted to structure it better. I wanted this I wanted to learn how to stream on YouTube, first of all, because I want to include pictures so I can better exemplify it, kind of like I do when I teach on school or in real life. But alas, here we are. I've thought about how to structure it, but I'm just gonna go ahead. First, to understand how contraception in general, but again, specifically the pill, changes the brain, I think it's important that we understand the brain. And the brain is extremely complex and fascinating. But when we read, especially when I read like studies on how the pill changes the brain, they tend to talk about, oh, the white matter, the gray matter, the corpus callosum, or certain structures that don't mean anything to people in general if you're not like a neuroscientist. And they actually tend to not mean a lot to doctors either. I've personally studied the brain for like almost 15 years now, and I've studied it to understand it in practice. Like I've studied it to understand why I do the things I do, the way I do them, and how I can use this information to change habits or reactions or motivation or whatever. Initially, I started studying the brain when I wanted to lose weight, and I wanted to understand why I eat when I'm not hungry and why I eat things that are not good for me, even when I know I shouldn't. I don't think that way anymore. I don't have the should or shouldn't anymore with food, but that's the topic for another day. But I came across a lecture by an American psychologist and professor, Doug Lisle, Lisle, and he has a very fascinating TED talk and lectures on YouTube. I'm going to link his lectures down below. Let me just write that down so I don't forget. And his title is called his lectures and his TED talk is called something like um, losing weight without losing your mind, I think. And he talks about why we have feelings because when he was a psychology student in the 80s, nobody knew why we had feelings. And they later figured out that our feelings are our guiding mechanism. So if you feel cold, you move to where it's warmer. If you feel warm, you move to where it's colder. If you're hungry, you look for food. And so this kind of became the thesis of his work. And he wrote a book called The Pleasure Trap. And in this book, he talks about how the brain basically works instinctually according to something called the motivational triad. And the motivational triad means three things that motivate and drive your behavior. This is seeking pleasure, primarily food and sex, It is avoiding pain, and it is conservation of energy. So, in practice, this means that if you're very, very hungry and you lived 10,000 years ago, you're going to want to go looking for food. You're going to avoid the route that is dangerous to the best of your abilities, and you're going to try to conserve as much energy as possible because staying alive required a lot of energy for our ancestors. So, if they could, they would tend to go gathering. Maybe they would find a tree with fruit. And eventually, if they couldn't, they might be driven to go hunting. That is obviously when you are really deprived of pleasure, like when you're very, very hungry, you're going to have this part of your brain, the seeking pleasure, a little bit override the pain avoidance, and it's going to override the conservation of energy. And I think you can notice this in practice with yourself, that if you are hungry, you're not going to go out to hunt. You're going to go to your fridge because it requires less energy and it gives you more pleasure without any pain involved. If you don't have any food at home, you might go to the nearest grocery store or you might drive there. So, whatever options are available to us, our brain is going to choose the option that gives us most pleasure with the least amount of pain and conserves the most energy. And the way we choose this is based on feelings. So if you just think about going out hunting today, you're not going to want to do it. It's not going to feel good. And you're most likely not going to do it. If you think about going to the fridge, you might actually do that. His work also centers around the fact that when you achieve pleasure, so you finally do have sex. Sex is about the survival of the species, and food is about the survival of the self. But when you do find food, especially after you've been hungry for a long time, or when you do have sex, especially if you've gone without for a while, your brain is going to release serotonin, which is a neurochemical associated with pleasure. On the pursuit of finding food and finding a mate to procreate with, your brain is going to release dopamine. That's why you get some type of feeling of achievement, which dopamine is associated with when you go to work or when you, I don't know, have a successful date, or worse, in modern society, these instincts can be hijacked by what is called supranatural stimuli. So, stimuli or inputs to our brain that are not present in nature. For example, food that's made in factories. So, eating a bag of chips is going to feel more pleasurable because the concoction of chemicals is made in a certain way so that you should become addicted to them. So, a bag of chips is going to be more tempting than a couple of carrots because chips are supranatural, aka they don't exist in nature. Tinder, pornography, um, gambling at a casino. These are all examples of supernatural stimuli that hijack your dopamine and serotonin pathways. When people, researchers in general, talk about human instincts, these are the instincts they talk about. Human beings are driven to food, sex, and rest. These instincts are coded into, or I mean, they're transmitted, I guess, to the higher facilities of your brain through thoughts and feelings. And eventually, we get to reason about them, which decision we should make. Some of them are unconscious, some of them are conscious. And he claims in his work that if you do some type of fasting, I guess, from these supernatural substances, your brain is going to reset and you're again going to be drawn to the natural food. So if you go on a diet, I guess. If you, for an amount of time, do not eat anything artificial, eventually your brain is going to crave fruit and vegetables again. Okay, so that was the fundamental concept that I learned about the brain. This was before I was in medical school, or maybe early years of medical school when I didn't really know more about the brain. Eventually, I learned about the neuroanatomy and the neurotransmitters and all of that. And then a couple of years ago, I started studying at the Justice College about um, female reproductive health. And when I put two and two together, and especially when I started studying about human evolution, and when I read a book called Sex, Time, and Power by Leonard Schlein, it's kind of like something I kind of understood it properly. So, what happens is in your brain, you have three evolutionarily separate parts, one could call them. If you could Google, this would be that I would have shown you a picture, but I don't know how to add that to the stream. But if you want to Google, you can Google something called the triune brain, Triune. So basically, the first part of your brain, the oldest, evolutionarily speaking, is your brainstem. So the part that kind of connects the big brain to the little brain and then to the spinal cord. And this is where you have certain cranial nerves and you have certain structures, but this is virtually where your instincts arise from. This is sometimes referred to as the reptile brain, and this part of your brain is preoccupied with your physical survival, like your body is supposed to survive. It's also occupied with having your genes be on the planet 100 years from now, and it's virtually a risk calculating machine determining how you should act in an emergency situation to ensure your survival. Given that this part of the brain is very, 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 very old, it is not adapted to modern life. So, this is, for example, um, if you see a lion in the wild, in an instant, this part of your brain judges whether you should run, maybe climb up the tree, maybe play dead. So this is the fight, flight, and freeze response. It's also the part of your brain that deals with the rest and digest. So when you're not in immediate danger, that part of your brain that tells you to fight or flight is turned off, and your blood and nervous system redistributes its efforts to the gastrointestinal system and that, I don't know, digestion, resting, and so on. Um, Given that this is very survival driven, women and men developed differently. And this is something that modern scientists and modern day doctors do not take into consideration when they talk about the differences about women and men. And I had a very interesting conversation about this because the other day I was talking to a friend, to my mother's friend's son, and he's a veterinarian. And I was explaining to him what I do with the whole menstrual cycle charting. And I said, it's kind of like, imagine if you went through vet school and you only learned about the male of a species. And then for some reason, the cows are suffering. They're not becoming pregnant. They're not producing milk. The entire milk industry is gone over a night. And you're the vet and you're supposed to fix it, but you'd never learned about female cows. So, using the knowledge you have about male cows, what do you do? He's like, I couldn't do that. I can't work without the complete knowledge. But that's virtually what doctors do, human doctors. It's kind of like working with one arm tied behind your back, and then when you learn about women, it's like untying that, and it's like finally medicine makes sense. But a lot of doctors learn about the male brain and they think they can just apply that to the female brain, unfortunately. So, evolutionarily speaking, males evolved in a way where the biggest threat to their life was in a hunting situation or in a fight with another man. So they were primed to fight or flight because those were the situations that were the most threatening to their lives, or like those were the reactions most appropriate in a situation where your life was threatened. Let me put it that way. For women, however, that wasn't the case. The case for women was, in my opinion, what revolutionized the entire species and what turned us from Homo, whatever came before us, into Homo sapiens. Sometime in human evolution, the theory goes roughly 300,000 years ago, based on several factors. We'll get into that another time, but one of them being if you've ever heard of mitochondrial Eve and the fact that we're supposed to have one common ancestor, because we get half the genes from our mothers and half from our fathers, except for the genes in our mitochondria, which comes only from our mothers, because the sperm lose their mitochondria when they swim towards the egg cell. So when the sperm meets the egg, the sperm doesn't come with the mitochondria to combine it with. And geneticists have figured out that every human being on the planet shares one common mother. Once upon a time, women started dying in childbirth. And to this day, women dying in childbirth are, or I mean, childbirth is the time in a woman's life when she's most likely to die. This was true up until the 1920s, I think. If you go to older cemeteries, you will see very often that women died when they were in their late teens or early 20s. And in most of the world, other than the Western world, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this is still true that childbirth is very, very dangerous to women. So our brain is still coded with this as a fear. And I'm sure if you are a woman, you have thought that thought, being scared of pregnancy, because it is instinctual at this point. So women didn't have the kind of fight and flight situation. They had to face an inner threat somehow. When women started dying in childbirth, they had to have a realization. They had to start figuring out, or probably that one woman who was the one common ancestor, maybe everybody else in her tribe died. Maybe she was the only one that actually had children afterwards. Uh, but anyway, one or a couple of women saw every other woman in their tribe die of childbirth. And this came from the combination when people started walking on two legs, our pelvises got more narrow. And at the same time, in human evolution, our heads grew bigger. And the baby's size with the size of the baby's head with the size of the maternal pelvis just was not compatible with the maternal life. And when something happens in animal evolution that leads to a species, excuse me, leads to a species potentially dying, human evolution applies this kind of adapt or die. So something happens that you figure out, or the species figures out how to survive, or they die. So for women, they had to like really think about what caused pregnancy. Human beings were smart. Like that's where the whole Homo sapiens comes from. The man who thinks. I think it was actually the woman who thinks, just based on this example, but we'll talk about that another time. Um, but generally speaking, if somebody eats a poisoned mushroom, or if somebody is bit by a snake, or uh, eaten by a lion, like we know to avoid lions and snakes and certain mushrooms. We've learned that and we've passed that on for generations. But what caused childbirth? What caused childbirth was very difficult for the human brain to comprehend, because animals up until that point live and lived in the moment. They didn't think back about what happened 3 weeks ago. In fact, they didn't even know what weeks were. They didn't know what months were. They didn't know what last year meant, because that wasn't a concept in their brain. So these women, or this woman, had to really, really, really think about what caused pregnancy, until she somehow managed to connect the dots to her having had sex 9 months ago. But what is 9 months if you don't have a watch and if somebody has not invented time? However, there is a big external clock that is very associated with human women, which is the moon. And without artificial light, women menstruate and ovulate with the moon. Knowing that you bleed once a moon is enough. You don't need to have the definition of a moon being 30 days or whatever to understand that if you have sex today and you do not get your period for 9 months, and then you become pregnant, then you give birth, that's kind of enough to figure out that sex might be the causing factor of childbirth and of death. So these women started avoiding sex. All of a sudden, it wasn't associated with pleasure, pain avoidance, and or conservation of energy. It became pleasurable, sure, but also painful, and it did not conserve energy. So pregnancy and childbirth is completely different in women than it is in animals. It demands so much more, and it also requires women to take care of the children for a much longer time, because human children, as we all know, are not independent when they're born, as certain animals are, for example. So basically, motherhood becomes a complete identity shift, and it is something, a choice you have to make, where you invest the rest of your life in your offspring. So you have to choose whether or not you're going to risk your life for this. And all of a sudden, when women started saying no to sex based on their newfound ability to think back in time, and also think ahead in time, and think about whether or not you want to make this choice in the moment, whether you want to risk your life or not. Sometimes they did, right, for the betterment of the tribe and for the survival of the species, which is still a very strong instinct, but sometimes they didn't. And what happens then in human evolution is that women develop free will and the capacity to inhibit their instinct to have sex. Which means that their feelings are going to be affected, and it's going to lead them to different behaviors based on a change in instincts, a change in feelings, and a change in reasoning. When women started saying no to sex at that time in human evolution, likely men still had within the male culture this practice of fighting one another, and whoever was the strongest and like the alpha male got to have sex with the women of his choice. I really recommend people to watch Chimp Empire. I think that's a really good show to exemplify kind of, I mean, chimp societies, but you see kind of the animal part of human beings reflected in their society. It's fascinating. So, anyway, the males were fighting, and the strongest one got to have sex with the women. But all of a sudden, the women were like, no thanks. Like, I don't want to be pregnant, or I don't want to be pregnant by you. Which caused men to do one of two things. Either they evolved to ask themselves the question, what do women want? And I think if you've ever had that, you're probably from that line of men that thought about what women want, aka, what do I have to do in order for her to sleep with me? And some men figured it out, and probably that's what your teen years are for, right? If you have the proper guidance from older men. But there were also some men that didn't actually care about that. So they forced themselves on women. And we still do have that kind of consciousness in men today, where a woman's no doesn't really matter. They don't really take that into consideration. Um, that's the reptile part of the brain. And for women, then there were two threats: dying in childbirth and a man not respecting a woman's no. Maybe some women can recognize that we still have these fears, and they are very much driving our behavior even to this day. They make us decide whether or not to go for a walk in the evening, alone or not alone, what we wear, what we say, where we go, who we talk to, how we talk to people. Like, these two fears are kind of fundamental to the experience of being a woman, I guess. And even if we didn't think about them, society will remind us, our parents will remind us, our friends will remind us, and so on. And women do not have the fight or flight in the same way as men do, because oftentimes women cannot fight and they cannot outrun a predatory man. What women can do, however, and again, remember that this part of the brain, the reptile brain, is associated with the survival of your physical body. It's not associated with the well being of your mental health. So, in a situation like that, women tend to default unconsciously to freezing or fawning. Another example of that is like if somebody puts a gun to your head and you're clearly outpowered, you're either going to freeze and not know what to do, or you're just going to fawn, which means go along with whatever the person is telling you to do. If they tell you to give them your wallet, you're going to give them your wallet. Uh, this is not something that the legal system takes into account, which is a shame, but not the topic of this conversation. Anyway, the next part of the human brain is the limbic system in medical terms. We can call it the elephant brain in simplified terms. And this is a part of your brain that deals with emotions and memory, long term memory. And basically, I mean, your entire brain is trying to keep you alive and to reproduce, but basically, this part of your brain, based on the experiences you had when you were a child, is going to associate certain things with pleasure and certain things with pain or disgust or anger or whatever. And this is kind of like, so your brain has an operating system of how to react in future similar situations. That's why if you've ever been on a coaster and you had fun, you associate that with fun. If you ever went on a roller coaster and you threw up afterwards, maybe you're not going to like it anymore. Or you, somebody laughed at you when you did a public speech in class, and because of that, you're kind of traumatized and you remember that you don't like speaking in front of people. So you're going to avoid those kinds of jobs because it's like just such a strong emotional reaction in you. This applies to women and to men. And this is why when certain men say that emotions are stupid, they're actually maybe just unaware of them because emotions drive all of our behavior. Again, if it's cold, you move to where it's warmer. If you're nervous, you either run away or you act a certain way. So this applies to women and to men. But because we have different fears to begin with, we're going to react emotionally differently to different situations. A woman walking on the street alone at night, seeing somebody dressed, I don't know, in a black hoodie, might cross the street. A man might not. But on the other hand, a man might be scared of rejection, so he doesn't talk to girls, or I don't know. You know what I mean? There are different emotions that are associated with the experience of being a woman and the experience of being a man. This is also the part of your brain that most directly talks to your hormones and has kind of like a direct connection through the hypothalamus and the thalamus and the pituitary gland. And this is the part of your brain that where your hormones influence your hunger, your thirst, your fear, your stress levels, cortisol, thyroid hormone, sex hormones, oxytocin and the love hormone, or what have you. And this is another part of your brain that's very different in women and in men because women have the estrogen and progesterone hormones that are very different than the male testosterone. Women also have testosterone, males also have estrogen and progesterone, but they work completely differently. So men have this daily cycle of testosterone. You can kind of think about that like the cycle of the sun. And women have this monthly cycle of estrogen and progesterone. You can kind of think about it like the cycle of the moon. So it's going to influence a woman differently and shifting from day to day over the course of a month, while men are kind of the same from day to day. They're not the same within a day because testosterone peaks in the morning, and at night you're going to have different feelings as a man than you did in the morning. But as a woman, it's going to shift in a 28, 30-day cycle. This is also affected by the cycle of the year and things like that, but that's a next level conversation. Okay, so women have this cycle of 28 days, and that means that before ovulation, estrogen is trying to influence your brain to find a mate and find somebody to impregnate you, basically. So you're going to be more social. You might start thinking more and more about sex as you get closer to ovulation. You might tend to overlook your boyfriend's stupid jokes, or I don't know. You tend to be more social. An estrogen deficiency will make you the opposite. That's why some birth control is, and especially the hormonal one, is associated with like depression or whatever. After ovulation, there's not really that much of a point to have sex because you're not going to get pregnant. You still can, and you still have the testosterone in you that's going to have, like, if you're healthy, you're going to have a sex drive all throughout the month. But now your estrogen levels are not as high. They're still there, but not as high. And what remains of the follicle from which the egg is released is called the corpus luteum, and those cells produce estrogen and progesterone, preparing your body and your brain for pregnancy. So, in practice, this means maybe you're going to be a little less social and you're going to want to stay home, organize things, or whatever you would need to do subconsciously to prepare for pregnancy. If you have too little testosterone, progesterone for whatever reason, it's going to make you less organized, less calm, and potentially more anxious and more PMSy. And then at the end of the cycle, the hormones drop if you did not become pregnant and it starts over. Okay, that's kind of like the elephant part of the brain, influenced by hormones working in cycles. And the next part of your brain is, I guess, the human brain. Some people call this the monkey brain. This is the analytical part of your brain. This is your rational thinking, planning ahead, finances, speech. It's kind of like the frontal lobe. When you drink a little bit, you are not inhibited, but when you don't, you can actually inhibit certain impulses, instincts, and emotions. If you are, I don't know, in a meeting, you're not going to act in the same way as when you're hanging out with your friends. This is like the mathematical, rational part of your brain. This is why men kind of claim that they're more logical. They tend to think that they use that brain more, like that part of the brain more than women. Obviously, not all men, but that's not a conversation we need to have. I'm generalizing for the sake of explaining generally. But the fact is that this part of your brain reasons based on the information that it has received from the other parts of the brain. So when they finally reach the top part of your brain, they it takes a little while to form a thought. It might take, I don't know, 30 seconds to form a rational, cohesive thought that's not instinctive or emotional. This is why you often get these thoughts in the shower or when you're driving or whatever, when you actually have time to allow your brain to do its job and you're not stressed or in a fight or flight system, and when you've actually processed your emotions. And of course, women and men are going to reach different conclusions because they do have different fears and they do have different things that are threatening their lives and they do have different emotions, especially for women, depending on what day of the month it is. And so, therefore, their logical thinking is still logical. It's just based on different information that the brain and the hormones is feeding them. Now, I'm not saying that every thought that comes out of you is logic per the definition of the field of logic, but it is the best that that your brain can do to filter out the noise of the external world and the internal world. Okay, so now to contraception. When a man who, first of all, only has the options of condoms or not, thinks about having sex, his reptile brain says, yes, sex. His emotional brain says, I really want to have sex. And his rational brain says, oh, I should probably, I don't know, ask this woman out or offer to buy her a drink. Or if you're in a relationship, I don't know, go give her a massage or whatever. And then he chooses whether or not he wants to put on a condom, right? For a woman, you have the fear brain that is telling you don't get pregnant at the same time as it's telling you have sex and reproduce. You have the emotional brain that, depending on situation, will tell you have sex or don't have sex. Obviously, depending on the man, time of the month, uh, uh, wherever you are in your life right now, your age, work, stress levels, health status, whatever. And then your rational mind takes this and reasons, and based on this, you make a decision. So, for example, when I started thinking about contraception, I was offered contraception at an age where I was not sexually active, and I couldn't see a reason for it. But another person that is offered contraception at a time where they are sexually active, and let's say, for example, at age 14. At age 14, your brain has not yet gone through the whole 14 days of wanting to get pregnant and your instincts driving you to that behavior, and then 14 days of maybe not wanting to get pregnant, and then 14 days of wanting pregnancy and 14 days of not wanting pregnancy. So you haven't gone through enough of those cycles in order for your brain to mature throughout that cycle and actually get to a mature and rational conclusion about what you want to do with your reproductive life. So if you are on birth control when you are 14, you might assume that there is no risk of you getting pregnant. This is not true. There is still a risk of pregnancy associated, but there's less of a risk. But you being told that there is no risk of getting pregnant and believing that there's no risk of getting pregnant is going to affect how your emotional brain responds to sex. And you might tend to make certain choices that you judge as rational because of the fact that you have eliminated the fear of pregnancy. So you might have sex earlier, you might have sex with men that you probably wouldn't have sex with otherwise, that you wouldn't deem as good enough fathers, or um, I don't know, whatever choice people do when they have sex. It's very difficult to generalize when you talk on YouTube, but your risk calculating machine is off. So it's going to lead you to make certain decisions that you wouldn't have done otherwise. Second of all, the artificial contraception works by inhibiting the production of estrogen and progesterone. This means in practice that you stop ovulating, but you also stop having the hormonal influence that is supposed to drive you to want to reproduce. And when you shut off that part of the brain, which means it's part of the seeking pleasure, you might no longer know what pleasure is. And you tend to maybe, I don't know, accept certain sexual interactions that are not pleasurable for you. You, first of all, get less blood supply to your lower regions. Your clitoris can shrink. You might struggle for a long time to achieve orgasms. Um, Depression is very common with contraception. Um, what else? Psychosis can happen. And then your brain is not developing cyclically. So it doesn't mature in the way that a female brain is supposed to mature. Of course, you can counteract this. It depends on how long you're on the pill for or whatever. And then your rational mind is going to reason differently. This is why we find studies of like women are attracted to different men when they're on birth control versus when they're off birth control, or why women get off birth control and they break up with their partner and are attracted to somebody else, or uh, they spent many years in a relationship without actually giving it some thought what they want in a father, in the father of their children, because the brain is just not making them think about these things, because the signals that are supposed to lead us to that kind of behavior or those kinds of thoughts is interrupted. I'm not going to go in more on the sexual aspect because I don't actually think I am allowed to talk about that on YouTube. I talk about that on school. But I do think it's important that we all take some time to become consciously aware of why we choose the method of contraception that we do. Um, do we do it because we're scared? I mean, is the choice we're making logical, or is it from our fear brain? Because many times women do go on contraception because they've been told by their doctor that this is the safest. And as soon as we talk about safety, it's kind of like a safety issue, right? It's a fear question. And talking to the lower part of your brain, the fear based brain is going, this is like what a triggered reaction is, right? This is when your brain reacts instinctively. It hears fear, you can't really reason with it. But if you take some time and think about it consciously, you can kind of map out why you make the choices you do. What part of the brain is the choice coming from? So fear of pregnancy, it's a valid fear. Like I get that. I'm not diminishing the fear. I'm just saying we should be aware of the decisions we make and how they actually affect our health. So fear-based decisions are one thing. Emotional decisions are another. In Sweden, when I was young, it was very common that women, girls, I apologize, girls, I'm talking about teenagers, took the pill to be cool. That was like kind of, I want to be part of the tribe um, emotion, which is a very strong instinct in human beings. Or if it's logical. And the logical part is very difficult to reason with also because sometimes we're just so convinced that what we're doing is the best thing for us. A lot of women have been told by their doctor that the only thing that they can take for their hormonal issues is the pill. Very rarely is that true. In my personal opinion, and in my personal experience, I have never found that to be true. I have found it to be true that this is the only thing that that specific doctor can offer, but he doesn't understand the underlying hormonal situation. So he just treats, or she just treats the patient with birth control as a symptom relief. But pain or irregular menstruation or whatever is never caused by a birth control deficiency. So the treatment, the root cause treatment, is not hormonal contraception. So yeah, the logical mind can also sometimes fool us. And this is why I'm very, very, very big on educating yourself, both on the topic and on your own body. And this is why I personally think that menstrual cycle charting is the best choice, not necessarily as a means of contraception, but it's just the education that you need about your own body. What is actually going on with your body? What is the hormonal status like? What days are you actually fertile? What days are you not fertile? Because within every cycle, there's actually just like 6 days that you can become pregnant. And removing your sex hormones for the duration of the entire month when you can only be pregnant 6 days is a very big decision and very influential decision on your, it's going to affect your body and your brain. I've just talked on the brain right now, but it's going to affect your entire body because everything in your body is dependent on estrogen and progesterone. Your bones, your muscles, your, I don't know, liver, your, I read about eyes the other day, apparently they have estrogen receptors. So the choice you make has to be an informed decision. um and then you also need to choose what kind of, I mean, I guess contraception. I think we're going to go into that in another one because I wanted to touch on how IUDs and like the contraceptive ring and whatever, everything that we've been sold to as local, it only has local action. It doesn't. The point of hormonal contraceptions is for the hormones to travel to your brain and tell the brain that you have ovulated so that you do not ovulate. That's why everything that has local actions has side effects in your entire body. But I see that I have gone way over time. So, yeah, I'll leave you with that. Our brain, evolutionary speaking, is very different. Women and men have a different outlook to what sex is and in what way it can potentially harm them. That's why we instinctually react differently to the topic of sex. Emotionally, we are wired to approach it differently, and intellectually, we're wired to approach it differently. Women are only fertile 6 days of the month, and maybe birth control is the right choice for you. Personally, I have opted out of that, and I chose menstrual cycle charting. And I do want more women to learn how to chart their menstrual cycle. Contraceptive reasons, sure. And of course, also to know when to time their pregnancy, because many times women are told that they have unexplained infertility when it's very easy to explain on a menstrual cycle chart. Maybe they're not timing intercourse properly, or there's something wrong with the luteal phase. We've talked about that. But the point is, this is just the basic information that every woman is entitled to. Every woman should know what's going on in her body. We should not feel like we're crazy or we have no idea what's going on when it is very easy. I'm just going to say it. It's very easy to learn, of course, with a teacher that knows what they're doing. But this is information that we all should have had when we started getting our periods. And I really want all women to have it, you included. If you want to work with me one on one, I do not have a lot of spots left, but let me know. If not, I have my course Understanding Women, which is the basics of women and goes into all of this in much more detail, on School currently. And I'm thinking about doing a course about what contraceptions to choose, where I go through all of it in more detail. Let me know what your biggest takeaway was. What were you? What was you? What were you taught about contraception? Were you told that it doesn't affect you? That were you told that it doesn't cause depression? Were you told that it does or does not cause weight gain? Were you told that it regulates your hormones? Were you told there are no side effects? Were you told that there are only local effects? What were you told? And were you ever told? See, that's where I was going to touch on. I was going to touch on basically contraceptions changes your instincts, your thoughts, your feelings, and your behavior. And all of these combined are your identity. So when you're menstrual cycle charting, you know that the thoughts and the behavior and the feelings or whatever are cycle specific and they're yours. But when you start birth control and you start having different thoughts, different feelings, different behaviors, all of a sudden you feel like you're not yourself. And this is something that thousands of women have told me, that they felt like they were not themselves when they were on contraception. And that's because artificially it changes your fear, it changes your reaction to sexual encounters, it changes hormonally your fluctuations, and it changes therefore how your brain responds to the impulses it receives. And I do know a lot of women have been told by their doctors that it's all in their head, which it is because that's where your brain is. But they've kind of been told that as like a gaslighting, I guess, gaslighting mechanism. So, yeah, let me know what you have been told about this. And if you learned something new and interesting, and if there is any other topic you would like me to talk about more. That was it for today. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening.